World War I period, but then found a fundamental difference between Expressionism and other movements like cubism and futurism, because he said, Faustian outbursts against an inimical world cannot create new levels of achievement. The Expressionist influence could not perform any service for architecture. Men who related to grimly serious work in housing developments abandoned themselves to a romantic mysticism, dreamed of fairy castles to stand on the peak of Monte Rosa, and on the left is Taut's page from Alpine Architecture, in which he has a page of a reconstruction of Monte Rosa. Others, this Giedion goes on, others build concrete towers as flexible as jellyfish, and that's clearly a slap at Erich Mendelsohn, although the Einstein Tower was not of concrete. It all seemed incorrect to Giedion. After showing why we need not be concerned with Expressionism at all, Giedion moved quickly on to what he thought was safer ground, the Bauhaus. I quote Giedion again, the surviving ideals of the Werkbund proved its salvation. From the very beginning, it set itself to unite art and industrial life. Of course, it didn't do any such thing. At least not until 1922-23. It was clearly Expressionist. I show you 2 pages to stand in for that early period. Feininger's Cathedral of Socialism, a Gothic cathedral from the opening manifesto 1919. On the right-hand side, an early chair by Marcel Breuer, who later was much better known for tubular steel furniture. His so-called African chair, hand-painted, hand-woven material with folkloristic references, I think to maybe Bambara Mask or some such thing. But even after 1923, when Moholy-Nagy arrived, the Bauhaus, although it talked a great deal about association with industry, it really was not always successful in doing that. Much of the products or prototypes that it produced, even in the middle period, products that looked more industrial, were not commissioned by industry. There were a few that made it to industry, but it became a great myth about the Bauhaus that it was an association between art and industry. That became an ideal after 23, but was not carried out. At any rate, Giedion holds up the Bauhaus as this great bastion of rationalism, whereas Expressionism belongs to mystical miasma that he despises. A fresh approach to German Expressionist architecture was possible once it became obvious by the 50s that Alvar Aalto and Le Corbusier gradually turned away from the international style to embrace sensuous, undulating forms and a forceful tactility. Here I'm using as a stand-in from Aalto his finished pavilion for the 39 New York World's Fair. But other examples could be used, like the Victorian Library interior or Baker Dorm at MIT a little bit later. And for Corbusier, I'm using as an early example of this turning against rationalism and the image of the machine, his house at Mat in the south of France from 1935. But again, there are many other country houses he did in contrast to his houses closer to the city that participate in this more folkloristic tradition, something that of course becomes much more important in his own work after the war in such buildings as Beauchamp on the right-hand side. A change was noticeable to an even greater degree in Corbusier's work after he shifted to an intensely expressive architecture in which he abandoned his earlier optimism regarding technology and instead reasserted the primacy of human activity and existence as a central architectural metaphor. I think in many of his later works, if one thinks especially of Chandigarh, human activity is emphasized, not always in undulating forms or textures, but also in the way he emphasizes the idea of entry, the idea of being in a place. This is what I'm talking about, a kind of existential approach to architecture that asserts man at the center, even though it's sometimes an alienated depiction. At any rate, it's a shift from his early 1920s belief in the machine as a savior of man. The fog of illegitimacy that had surrounded Expressionist architecture for so long then began to lift gradually during the 1960s. First, there was Dennis Sharp's book on modern architecture and Expressionism in 1966. Not terribly good, but it made a beginning. Then Franco Borsi's and Koenig's Italian book Architettura dell'Espressionismo, but English captions for the illustrations and synopsis for the text in 67. And then finally Wolfgang Pain's Expressionist architecture of 73. That also was a little bit problematic because it included futurism, Italian futurism, in a discussion of Expressionism. But nevertheless, there are books now on Expressionist architecture. Expressionism in architecture had at last been given its proper place in 20th century history. Where Giedion had seen Expressionism as art interlude, the mannerist phase that interrupted the flow of progress toward modernity. We now have, I think, a more coherent view of history. I think Giedion and Pevsner, it's true for Pevsner's depiction also, he does not deal with Expressionism, derides it as Giedion had done. They believed that the international style would become the style of the 20th century. I think they used older models of history when periods lasted for a much longer time. Giedion had been trained by Wolfgang, the Swiss art historian. But I think that they should have been a little bit more astute because already in the early 20s, and before that, with futurism, with Russian constructivism, with Dutch de Stijl, there were very quick successions and phases. And I think this quick pace development is characteristic of the 20th century in general. And just because Expressionism did not last terribly long, did not mean that it had nothing to contribute to architectural ideas, and this is where Giedion is wrong. Now, with these new publications on Expressionism, we should consider Expressionism has been discussed. This should be the end of our discussion, but happily for architectural historians, they are never definitive histories. They're only redefinitions, constant redefinitions of what I say also is going to be redefined at some later point. Because these monographs on Expressionism attempted to resurrect the movement from oblivion, they necessarily had to stress the uniqueness of Expressionism. They performed a useful service in introducing a younger generation to Expressionism. What remains to be done today, though, and this will bring me to the main point of my discussion, is a more contextual view of Expressionism. To be sure, Expressionism needed to be studied as a discrete incident at the outset, but now that we're clearer about it as a movement, it is necessary to reintegrate it with contiguous developments, with what came before and after. I'm not concerned here with the sources and influences of Expressionism so much as its relationship to non-Expressionist developments in German architecture. For instance, are there any continuities between Expressionism and the new objectivity, the period that came after 1923? In architecture, it was sometimes called the Neues Bauen, new building, and that leads into the international style, of what came to be called by Hitchcock and Johnson the international style, a period that Giedion approves of, but not of Expressionism. What I want to show is that there may indeed be a connection between the two. To look for connections between Expressionism and the more sober period of the later 20s then might help us understand both phases of modern history better. In suggesting such an approach, I'm using Bruno Taut as a succinct example. Taut was a central figure of Expressionism after World War I. Expressionism in painting and literature, of course, had reached full development before the war, but architecture, more closely bound to economic conditions and construction, patronage, etc., attained its height between 1918 and 1920, after the war, when political and social turmoil contributed to the drying up of most architectural commissions. Architects during this brief period were free to fantasize in a way that in our age is more comparable to the freedom enjoyed by artists. Taut was the catalyst of several of the major developments in Expressionist architecture after World War I. The most important of these was his leadership of the Work Council on the Arts, founded in November 1918, and echoing in spirit the Worker Soviets of the revolution. The Work Council was made up of architects, artists, writers, and other intellectuals. Work Council members discussed such matters as the place of the architect in society, governmental subsidies for architectural experimentation, architectural education in a socialist state, which most members assumed had arrived. Among the best-known architect members were Gropius, Erich Mendelsohn, and Otto Bortmann, but also many others who are less well-known outside of Germany. There were then other associations as well. I won't go into details with them. The Work Council also held exhibitions, some of them in workers' quarters of Berlin, that were kept open at night so workers could see them. They also exhibited children's drawings of architecture and workers' drawings of architecture, not just their own. Ideas and designs were exchanged in circular letters, and many of the proposals by these architects were published in a periodical called Frühlicht, Dawn, of which Taut was the editor, and which is, as far as I know, the only expressionist magazine dealing with architecture. Also, Taut was the head of the Work Council on the Arts at the outset, but once it became too large, he relinquished his position. It was taken over by Gropius. It's very significant. I think Taut always liked to be on the cutting edge. He liked stimulating discussion, but when it became too large, too bureaucratic, he got out. Gropius came in, because Gropius was very good as an ambassador, as a mediator, and I think this was his main contribution at the Bauhaus, being able to keep together so many different architects and artists, but their personalities were quite different. Taut is best known today for his expressionist utopian books, City Ground and Alpine Architecture of 1919, from which these are illustrations on the screen, and then A Dissolution of the Cities and World Building Master of 1920. His grandiose proposals for the reworking of Alpine peaks in Alpine architecture, of course, seemed utterly and hopelessly romantic to someone like Giedion, and had absolutely nothing to do with architecture, to someone of Giedion's persuasion who came in contact with architecture in the late 20s, when even expressionist architects had begun to move away from this. The German Revolution of 1918 had engendered high optimism among architects of a socialist persuasion, such as Taut. He never was a card-carrying socialist, but was a socialist with a small s. Certainly in 1918 and 19, there was no reason why the German Revolution could not be compared with the Soviet Revolution of 1917. At the same time, the economy made actual building nearly impossible, at least until about 1923, then a rampant inflation was brought under control. So most construction really only resumes after 1983. The tension produced between extremely optimistic expectations and the bleak physical realities of the time explain to a large degree the energies poured into utopian schemes. You might also compare this with the Soviet Union after 1917 and fantastic schemes such as the ones by Tatlin, which could probably not have been carried out at the time. In fact, they're not. And once construction starts up in the later 20s, buildings look very different from the more fantastic schemes that were produced immediately after the revolution. However, in the Soviet Union, the revolution was more consistent, was ongoing, whereas in Germany, the initial optimism was dashed by what actually happened, by the conservatives who had retained power, by the bureaucracy that was still in place. So many of the architects were fairly quickly disillusioned after the initial optimism of the revolution. One can also see Taut's reworking of Alpine peaks as an implied critique of contemporary conditions. The state of the world was found wanting, and in its place the architect has constructed a better nature of his own making. In any case, Taut did not expect to carry out such projects. He wrote in his books, these are utopian schemes, I do not expect they will be carried out. So even he was aware that these were fantasies, but I think he wrote down dreams in these pages, which he, of course, had a right to do since there were no actual commissions around, and I can't really criticize him for this kind of romanticism because at the time there was no choice. What Giedion could not have known when he saw in these schemes only signs of romantic mysticism and Faustian outbursts was that by the 1960s, under the label of earth art and conceptual art, large-scale alterations and modifications of the American desert, the Australian coastline, etc., were not just being proposed, but were actually carried out, but now not by architects, but by artists such as Christa, Wolf de Maria, or Michael Heisenberg. It has now become more difficult to write off expressionist projects such as these as simply Faustian, Nietzschean, or as typically German, which was done in early books on expressionism. The pacifist and anarchist content of Alpine architecture and dissolution of the cities was clearly a reaction to the war. Taut's design of social utopias is, as well, a much more personal reaction to the real powerlessness architects of his conviction faced at the time. Only to this extent can expressionist architecture be seen as self-expression. For if we look below the surface effects of Taut's more megalomaniac schemes, we can find elements that indicate a connection with his pre- and post-expressionist works, which are much more pragmatic. Alpine architecture of 1919 has no text as such, only illustrations with captions. These are meant to function as pictograms or ideograms. Ideas are communicated as revelations, largely through brief graphic presentations. And the drawings in all of these books are very brief, they're sketches, they're not worked out carefully. The longest verbal statement in Alpine architecture occurs on the page I'm showing you on the right-hand side now. It's headed Peoples of Europe, and I got the core of this. He writes, people of Europe, have we ever become happy through function? Always comfort, good food, culture, knife, fork, trains, bathrooms, and also cannons, bombs, and instruments of murder. The functional without a higher idea is a bore, and boredom brings quarrel and war. Preach peace and the social idea, unquote. The pacifist idea on which this is based is perhaps naive. The public is to participate in the reconstruction and beautification of the globe, to keep boredom at bay and thus to avoid war. It's very unusual, peace program, but that's what it was. Pages from Alpine architecture again. In the left slide, one arrives at the shore of an Alpine area by boat, and the ascent to the Gristle House, a kind of nirvana at the mountaintop, is through a narrow gorge flanked by a gurgling mountain stream. The gorge is spanned by glass arches, which become more intense in their coloration as one ascends. At the very top, the valley is spanned by a glass screen in which are placed aeolian harps, i.e. color and music, sound and light are used. In the right slide, an Alpine lake is shown with floating glass ornaments. Important, there's constant movement implied in that, which of course we don't see in the drawing as such. The walls of the valley are braced by concrete arches filled with colored glass to resemble a gigantic flower, and the whole is meant to be seen from an aerial perspective. Emphasis on synesthesia, on the senses, on sensory stimulation is only one of the aspects of expressionism, however. These are now pages from the World Building Master of 1920, which is a book also with very brief drawings and brief captions. and it's presented as a theater piece, clearly indicated on the title page by the curtain that opens. Then we have unfolding a spire that rises from below, from a bottomless stage. Arches appear, kind of Gothic architecture, if you will. A hall unfolds with arches. Almost as soon as it's in place, it collapses again, and forms regroup as if they were a kaleidoscope. I am not showing you all the pages, I'm just showing you elements of it, but you get the idea of the almost filmic quality of this presentation. It is movement of architecture, development, evolution that is emphasized, not form as such, not a fixed form, but changing form. Then we move to more cosmic proportions. Comets appear, dance by. Then a globe rises from below, rain on the right-hand side, rainbow, and out of this comes this development of little houses that pop up from the earth as if out of cabbages. It's a kind of archetypal garden city that we have here. But then as soon as that is in place, it disintegrates again and forms regroup. So again, the emphasis is not on a happy end of the garden city, but on constant movement, on change. Kind of disintegration. This is architecture as theater then, where architectural form as such is almost completely abandoned for the sake of construction and deconstruction as a cosmic event. More importantly, for the sake of an architecture that is continually shifting. Taut's depiction of architecture as changing may indeed be a reflection of the chaotic state of events after 1918. But I think it's not only a reflection of that, but it also introduces an anti-monumental model to architecture, an architecture that is in a constant state of becoming something that is new in architecture, and of course cannot be applied directly, but I think it introduces an idea that goes against traditional norms of architecture as fixed monument. Then I move on to another book of 1920, The Dissolution of the Cities. On the left-hand side, you see, again, very sketchily done, the old metropolis at the top of the left-hand page, crumbling, collapsing, and then toward the bottom, new communes, flower-like. So the image of the flower is used as a metaphor for new communes. The dissolution of the cities is expressionist in its anti-urban stance. Taut proposes here the abandoning of existing cities with only the most necessary industrial centers left intact, which you see on the right-hand side. In the place of cities, he proposes very small, more or less self-sufficient agricultural and crafts communes, which deal with each other through barter, no money, in this new society. And these new communes then emerge like flower-like configurations on the left-hand side. The idea that existing cities perpetuate the old social order and must therefore be replaced with a decentralized form of community had wide currency in socialist circles and anarchist circles before the war. And one should compare it perhaps, not in form, but in concept, with the de-urbanist movement in the Soviet Union in the later 20s, and the anti-urban attitudes contained in the pre-war works of expressionist painters. On the left-hand side is a work by Kirchner. It's called Street with Red Lady, a prostitute followed by a phalanx of men, but very attenuated, sharp-edged, not pleasant. On the right-hand side is a 1914 work by George Gross called Pandemonium. Again, an urban scene that is very constricted, claustrophobic, filled with people, and all sorts of unpleasant events. And this is rather characteristic of expressionist painters before the war also. the city is depicted as a place where unpleasantness occurs. The only calm approach among the expressionists you find in their rural depictions of landscape. And I think this idea that you have to move away from the old urban center crops up in architecture as well. Again, from one of the communes now, from dissolution of the cities, again, so still represented in a metaphoric sense, in the same way that Ebenezer Howard in his book on Garden City showed his plan in a very schematized fashion, not in a way that would actually be carried out. This is how this has to be read as well. The communes here suggest decentralization on a visual level, but dissolution of the cities also contains Taut's clearest political statements among his utopian books, though the illustrations again have only very brief captions. Appended to the book are large number of quotations from anarchist writers such as Kropotkin, from socialists and communists such as Engels, with comments on the state of government, of the city, and of the family. Taut's stance, I think, on the whole, is essentially anarchist. There are to be no nations, no governments, no marriage, no educational institutions. All learning will be acquired through an apprenticeship system, through work. In this respect, dissolution of the cities is rather like William Morris's news from nowhere, although it's not medievalizing like Morris's image of future.
What's in the center?
Pardon?
What's in the center?
A communal building. The communes are rather small. They were to consist only of about 500 people each. And there are crafts communes and agricultural communes. During the harvest, the people in the crafts commune were to help out those in the agricultural commune. And they were then paid with goods, with wheat, grain, etc. Together with Taut's interest in new forms of settlements goes his proposal for a flexible house on the left-hand side now. Its rooms can be changed according to its inhabitants' mood. Separate rooms if one feels contemplative and needs quiet. Rooms that are open to each other if one feels more gregarious. This house is not a static symbol of a dwelling then. It functions almost like a second skin which responds to changing feelings. And the color in his description is also used to enhance the building in a psychological, perceptual sense. So the idea of movement that we saw in Rural Building Master is now applied more specifically to architecture and how it could be used in an actual work of architecture building that does not have fixed rooms, but can be shifted, changed, can be altered according to needs. Now becomes a little bit more practical than in a Rural Building Master. Taut's proposals for mobile architecture, where the mechanistic elements of movement are suppressed, it should not be compared with futurism, where mechanistic elements are held up as a great ideal. Mechanical systems may be used in these schemes, but they're laid down. They're there only for the sake of human beings and their well-being. So the emphasis is on man, not on the machine. Machines may be used, but they're not there as primary images. Movement and mobility and this flexibility is an important feature of Expressionism. And the belief in the reality of feelings and experience leads Taut later on in his housing after 1923-24 to accord the psychological requirements of his clients a great degree of importance. Now, to backtrack a little bit, to detail a little better this idea of movement and flexibility and where it comes from, I want to show you the sources for Taut's glass house for the Werkbund exhibition of 1914 on the right-hand side. Of course, the model factory by Gropius for the same exhibition is much better known, and that is the building that was held up by someone like Giedion or Pevsner. On the left-hand side is a Kokoschka portrait of Paul Scherbar, an expressionist writer who became a very close friend of Taut in 1912 and influenced Taut in many of these ideas. Completely untraditional forms were invoked by most expressionists to symbolize the new age for which these projects were designed after 1918. But behind this nominal freedom of expression lay a venerable tradition, and it's this tradition I want to mention briefly. Unstable, mobile forms and transparent effects became the expressionist metaphor for a changed society. At the core of this metaphor is the image of the crystal, or glass. The two are used interchangeably. Crystal or glass used almost as the same kind of thing, and often in association with translucent or highly reflective materials such as precious stones or gold, are an age-old symbol of spiritual revelation that goes back to Solomon's temple and to visions of the New Jerusalem in the New Testament. According to old Jewish and later Arabic legends, King Solomon is supposed to have built a house of glass to reveal to him, especially with a floor of glass, to reveal to him whether the visiting Queen of Sheba was a woman or, as was commonly suspected, a genie, i.e. a sorceress. The Queen of Sheba, not familiar with the illusory effects of glass architecture, glass floor, believed that when she was ushered into the throne room, believed that Solomon was sitting in water, and to step over to him across the water, she lifted her dress to keep it dry, exposing her hairy legs, supposedly a demonic attribute in women. She was revealed then as a sorceress. And important is that the glass revealed, that glass becomes the image of revelation in this legend. In Arabic legends of the early Middle Ages, Solomon's role as patron of glass architecture then expands to truly fantastic proportions. He's said to have commanded genies to construct for him a submarine dome of glass and an aerial city of crystal, and this city flies in the air. So the idea of mobility is there from the very beginning also. Glass, crystal, transparency, reflection, and mobility are there from the beginning. Crystal and water have replaced glass as the imagery of translucence in later legends, and King Solomon is no longer just a wise ruler, as he was earlier on, but a man imbued with superhuman powers. He's Lord of sea and air. In fact, he seems to now possess those very powers of sorcery with which the Queen of Sheba was credited in the Judeo-Christian tradition. By revealing her, he has acquired powers. Such imagery affected medieval literature then, especially legends of the Holy Grail, which of course include architectural forms. I can't show you slides of that because they were usually not depicted, but very widely read legends of the Holy Grail, then adapted Arabic legends of King Solomon's power of architecture, usually not the Temple of Solomon that we know from the Bible, but these more fantastic ideas of mobile glass architecture. And this conception of the Holy Grail, then, of course, affected the construction of the Gothic cathedral, not in its actual structural aspects, but the use of glass, the extent of glass, and the mystical transformation of the interior that was made for. The polychrome glass in the Gothic period usually stands for spiritual transformation, so it now has attained a religious importance, as it did in the images of the Holy Grail. After the Middle Ages, the crystal or glass metaphor becomes more esoteric, it goes underground, so to speak. It becomes a symbol of the alchemist's quest for spiritual salvation. That is the philosopher's stone, which the alchemist sought for, is made of crystal or gold, symbolizing through the transformation of a lowly material such as earth into a precious substance, the alchemist's quest for transcendence from lowly flesh to a higher existence. The crystal metaphor entered the literature of the Romantics in the 18th century, essentially in this esoteric form. You can look at writings by Novalis, Nietzsche, and then also in the early 20th century, Peter Behrens, who had become an architect at the Darmstadt Artist Colony, used still this image of the crystal as a philosopher's stone. In the opening ceremony of the Darmstadt Artist Colony, they held a theatrical festival in which Behrens was dressed as Nietzsche and held a shape like this of glass that was meant to be a representation of the philosopher's stone. I think what is important in this, when the image connoted religious transformation or larger transformation, salvation, revelation, it was an architectonic image. When it became esoteric, when it became the quest for the self or transformed self, with the alchemists and the Romantics, it shrinks and it becomes an image, a pebble-like image that then represents the brain. So it becomes much more personalized in this later literature. So it's an interesting metaphor because it also itself went through shifts, although the idea of glass and gold reflection, translucence is maintained, mobility also, but it shrinks and becomes an image of the self in later literature. It's essentially in this form that it entered the writings of Paul Scherbart, who began to write short stories in the 1890s. Scherbart is best known for his book Glass Architecture of 1914, which by the way was dedicated to Taut, and the Glass House by Taut in turn was dedicated to Scherbart. But many of Scherbart's ideas had been stated previously in short stories and novels. As in much of the literature containing crystal imagery, it is associated by Scherbart with transformation. That is, glass will not merely produce a better society, but the glass or crystal metaphor appears in mobile form to make the idea of transformation even more palpable. So the transformation, of course, suggests change of the self or of the society at large. Such mobile imagery occurs, for instance, in his two short stories, one, Transportable Cities of 1909, and another, The Traveling City of 1910, but in many others as well, in which a constant regrouping of architectural elements occurs. Such concepts of mobility then lead him to keep an open mind to all patterns of habitation and allow him to apply his concept of flexibility to planning. In a pamphlet by Scherbart of 1909 called The Development of Aerial Militarism and the Dissolution of the European Land Armies, Fortifications and Navies, he postulates that with the introduction of airplanes, which can drop what he called dynamite torpedoes, this of course before bombs had been invented, the old type of warfare with standing armies and fixed fortifications or fronts will be over. Equipped with such deadly weapons, each nation, instead of attacking its enemy armies at the front, it will attack cities in the interior. A very prophetic statement before such events had occurred. Because of his prediction of aerial attacks against cities, he further proposed this as a defensive measure to decentralize cities, i.e. if you don't have great urban centers, it's more difficult to attack the enemy. Also prophetic because that was America's problem in Vietnam. In Vietnam, there were no major cities to attack, and the enemy could hide in the woods. So I think many of his statements, although he's a fantast in many ways, also predicted future developments of warfare. The notion of the small garden city is introduced by Scherbart in the context of this pacifist attitude. In a more whimsical mood, he suggests that Berlin be renamed New Paris and Paris New Berlin in order to confuse possible aerial attacks. Up to this point, we are dealing essentially with a fantastic literary tradition that had found an echo in Gothic architecture, of course, and it would be reified again through Taut in Expressionist architecture, i.e. at this point, the imagery gradually re-enters construction and becomes an architectonic image again and moves away from the more self-centered, personalized image of the crystal brain. Scherbart, who became a close friend of Taut in 1912, was to have a profound effect on Taut's conception of the glass house, again on the right-hand side. Taut then comes back to using the crystal metaphor in architectural terms. The interior of the pavilion, very small, centralized pavilion, not a terribly impressive building as such. The experience of it was rather of a different sort. Once one entered it, the exterior was cut off. Glass is used, but not to look outside. No picture windows here. He used stained glass panels by some of the Expressionist painters, polychrome effects, a fountain with light emitted only through a kind of Roman impluvium, conluvium effect at the top, so one could not see reality outside, but only the interior. One went down past this stepped fountain, which was lit from behind with glass beads in it, to a lower hallway that was completely dark and lined in purple velvet. So it was almost like a magical mystery tour. You entered at the very top, very lit, and then you descended down through the building until you came to the darkest point. At the very end of this dark tunnel was a screen against which were projected abstract forms, kaleidoscopic effects. There are no views of that at all. I can't show it to you. But the idea of mobility then was actually shown just before one left the building. But the building then is more about an evocation of this symbolism of glass and crystal and the mobility that it meant to evoke. Also, it obviously has some of the synesthetic effects that are characteristic of Expressionism, light and sound, how they're together.
Is that a waterfall through the middle there?
Yeah, the water from the top. This is an upper floor, descends down by these steps. These are then again pages from Alpine architecture. It is clear from these pages that the crystal structure which you see on the left, transformed by colored light beacons on the right-hand side, represents transcendence, transformation, mobility via light in this case at the same time. Thus, images of mobility and flexibility so frequent in Expressionist architecture spring from one and the same idea. They have little in common with mechanical mobility, but stand for the concept of a new age of transformed mankind. And of course, through Taut, Erik's idea were passed on to many other architects in the Work Council. I'm showing you only one of them, Mises' schemes for glass skyscrapers, which were first published in Dawn, Taut's magazine. And I was going to talk about Mendelsohn also, who was a member of the Work Council, and although his architecture doesn't use crystal symbolism, but he's interested in mobility and transformation as well. This is a series of hewn sketches from 1920 where it begins with the image of a dune by the shore, but then moves on to more architectonic fantasies from that. Or even his trench sketches done during the war, where you have buildings that jut out from their ground line beyond it. You get the sense of movement below, but not in a mechanical fashion, but more in this transcendental way, even though formally Mendelsohn is quite different than Taut. Now, Expressionist projects continually touch on the fantastic and the impossible, but they contain ideas that could be brought down to earth, ideas that in other contexts could be subsumed by gravity. Though Taut's utopian books are clearly expressionist, they contain concepts such as an emphasis upon sensory factors, upon architecture that is adaptable, and upon a strong sense of community, ideas which can be traced to Taut's and a pre-expressionist group. The continuity then is not in the style of the forms, but in the concepts and ideas that are put forward. To do this, I must backtrack a little bit. Taut's initial architectural training was at the so-called Bauschule, building school, rather than a polytechnic school, which many architects attended. Gropius was trained at a polytechnic school. Bauschule training was more practical in contrast to the polytechnic. In a Bauschule, one attended school only in the winter months, during the summer months when there was no construction in those days because mortar froze. It's all changed now. But architecture students worked on with experienced architects in the apprenticeship system during summers. So from the very beginning, someone who attended Bauschule had much more practical experience than someone who attended a polytechnic school, which was more conventional in that one went to school first and then worked as an apprentice for an architect. Taut was apprenticed for 4 years between 1904 and 1908 to Theodor Fischer, an architect who then had a thriving practice in Stuttgart and later in Munich. Erich Mendelsohn, Hugo Hering, Ernst May, and the Dutch architect J.J.P. Aug were all to study with him when he taught at Munich. In fact, as a teacher, he's as important as Peter Behrens, although he's not really terribly well known here. At about the time Taut worked for him, Fischer designed Mintersdorf, which you see on the screen here, a small factory town in southern Germany begun around 1903. Fischer's architecture at the time Taut worked for him was marked by its reference to vernacular features and the use of principles of perceptual unity that derived from Camillo Siddes's writing in the late 19th century. Taut himself designed a number of housing estates before the war. The most important one of these is his design for the so-called garden city, really a garden suburb of Falkenberg to the southeast of Berlin, executed for the German Garden City Association. All of the garden cities in Germany were not pure garden cities in that they did not have full-fledged factory system associated with them. They were not totally self-sufficient, but that's true for most of the English garden cities as well. I think the only pure form was Ebenezer Howard's original suggestion, and after that there were all sorts of compromises made. The existing building code at Falkenberg required single homes in the northeast sector of the town and row houses in the southwest. Taut later wrote that this restriction was not altogether bad because it made for a mix of housing types, something that he would incorporate into many of his later estates, a mixture of both types, even apartment units. Uniformly wide streets he found not only dull but also uneconomic, and requested that some of the smaller streets be made even narrower, so there's a clear shift from wider streets to narrower streets. He used some turbine glasses and setback of row houses in the middle of blocks to create the feeling of places rather than traffic routes. These are all principles that are borrowed from Camillo Siddis. These are not ideas that Taut put forward for the first time, and then it's really the way he put these ideas together. However, the central element in this feature seems much more formal. The central shopping streets is along here, more axial. The rest looks more picturesque. This more formal ideas, again taken from English garden cities of the period, and the mayor of the town, the city council, and Taut, in fact, went on a study trip to England, so they really did their homework before this was designed. But this central part of the village is also a reference to local traditions. It contains a village green, which many of the smaller villages around Berlin had at the time. Well, I missed a slide on the right-hand side, the bird's eye view of Falkenberg, where you get a better sense of the single houses in the foreground and row house in the distance, and then there's a feature that cuts back. The houses themselves are also close to a vernacular tradition, though for reasons of economy they're restricted to 5 basic types. Falkenberg was low and middle income housing. Despite the severe economic limitations faced by Taut in projects of this sort, he enlivened this otherwise rather plain architecture through the use of bright stucco colors in place of the more traditional grays. The colors were olive green, pale red, white, blue, and yellow-brown. The critic Adolf Behn, whose description is the only one that gives us an idea of the color scheme. There were no color photographs of this, obviously. They were changed later on. He saw in the use of bright colors a clear relationship to expressionist painting. However, Taut, a few years later, made a trip to Russia, during which he saw very brightly painted houses. And he confirmed his belief that bright color was not just indigenous to Mediterranean regions, but also had a long tradition in northern vernacular architecture and was therefore not inappropriate. It seems so that the use of bright color was the most shocking aspect of this garden suburb. The public dubbed the paint box colony. Falkenberg eventually had 1,500 dwelling units. These were erected over a long period of time and were not finished until after World War I. 1918 to 20 was then the most intensive expressionist phase. The revolution led to great optimism regarding social building programs, but this was deflated quickly. Few buildings of any sort were commissioned in the immediate post-war years. In early 21, Taut's search for meaningful work was answered when he was appointed director of Magdeburg's Department of City Planning. Magdeburg was a fairly large city in Germany. His appointment there by Magdeburg's progressive mayor and liberal city council, which at that time consisted primarily of blue-collar workers, was due to his pre-war work on an estate near Magdeburg. Taut, while there, devised an expansion plan for Magdeburg, master plan, reconstruction scheme for the inner city, but because of the inflation at the time, none of these schemes were carried out. So although they were more realistic and pragmatic, they remained only paper projects also. Taut's many designs associated with Magdeburg then, they're no longer utopian. They could have been executed, but of course were not for economic reasons. In the absence of new construction, Taut turned to colored stucco to achieve the transformation into a synesthetic architecture he had proposed in Alpine architecture. He changed the center of the city using color occasionally to emphasize existing features, at other times as counterpoint. These are examples from the inner city that are actually carried out by artists, not by Taut himself, a redefinition of older buildings in Magdeburg when their stucco exterior had to be renovated. More important than these examples, and again I don't have illustrations of these, Magdeburg was very heavily bombed, so all of this work, or much of this work has disappeared. More important than these examples, Taut used the necessary periodic renovation stucco buildings require as a means to involve the public at large. When private houses required renewal, the city planning office advised owners on colors and how they might be used, but had assumed no legal power to enforce any design standard. Understandably, the results were very mixed. Some critics attacked Taut for opening up architecture to such public involvement, but many others thought it was an interesting experiment that was debated very widely in newspapers at the time. Both Ernst May, who was an important architect in Frankfurt at the time, and the Belgian architect of housing, Victor Bourgeois, traveled to Magdeburg expressly to see this transformation of Magdeburg, and both conceded the importance of color in urban design. The use of vivid color then is an obvious continuation of an expressionist interest, but that would affect architects of the new objectivity later on. Ernst May, who had seen Magdeburg and knew Taut's other work, would use polychrome effects at Werderstadt in Frankfurt in 1928 in much the same way as Taut had used it in his own housing schemes. Also, the public involvement in questions of architecture that Taut had brought about at Magdeburg can be seen as a continuation of this ideal of a communal and cooperative architecture voiced earlier on. Of course, it was on a much reduced scale. Okay, let me quickly move on these illustrations from contemporary periodicals 1923 to show how bad housing, the housing situation had become in Berlin. Typical apartment units with dark back courts, illustrated by the artist Ken Kolowitz on the right-hand side of areas where children had no playgrounds. Taut left Magdeburg in 1923 after the city council had become increasingly conservative. He returned to Berlin in 1924, became the consulting architect of Gerhard, a cooperative home association which had been founded in April of that year under the leadership of the city planner Martin Wagner. And it consisted of cooperative housing associations set up by blue-collar unions. These non-profit cooperatives financed housing for workers at a cost considerably below that of speculative building. As the consulting architect of Gerhard, Taut was responsible between 1924 and 1932 for the design of more than 10,000 new housing units. I'm showing you one of his larger and best-known estates called Brits, sometimes Horseshoe Estate after that central feature, that was begun in 1925. The Fritz estate was designed with Wagner. As in most of Taut's estates, the larger apartment houses were done as perimeter development. Apartment units here and here along the major thoroughfare, along the Horseshoe, and then along the periphery, the interior were row houses, small scale. The entrance to the Horseshoe on the left-hand side, you look back at the main thoroughfare, the shops and a restaurant along there, and then once you enter, large green in the center, surrounded by apartment units, 3-story in height, with some private gardens near the houses themselves. The garden side of the long blocks along the main street. Generally, you see a typical plan on the right-hand side. Walk-ups, they follow pretty much the Dutch model, but without long internal corridors, and also like the Dutch model, with access to usually 2 apartment units from each stairwell, cross ventilation and terraces, a great improvement on the older inner city housing. A detailed view of that Horseshoe, the apartment unit, which has underpasses that lead out to the core of the development with its row houses, and you see those through that underpass with pitched roofs. Unlike many of the other architects like Roches or Mies, he had no, he was not polemical about the flat or the pitched roof. He used a roof that was more or less flat in the apartment units, was actually slightly inclined for water runoff with an overhang on that side. You see the outside here. He emphasized stairwells by means of color. He also carried the color across the attic zone to make the building appear lower. So again, he uses color here now, no longer in simply in a synesthetic effect, but he uses it in a planning sense. In order, it's perceptual, experiential, but to make the building seem smaller than it is, to bring it down to scale, so to speak. Apartment unit, the row houses in the inner part of the development, and here he often used what in German is called Kopfbau device. At the beginning of the street, he pulls the house out slightly on both sides to create an enclosure, an entry point to the street, rather than just a traffic thoroughfare. And he emphasized that also by means of color in many cases, not always. The private gardens behind these, you see the almost rural effect of these buildings, although this is in the outer periphery of Berlin. Another a smaller scheme, one block development where he used just perimeter housing, apartment units. I'll go over this very quickly. Very ingenious kind of plan here. This reversal of stairwells in, outside, inside, T-shaped forms, set back slightly to give it a degree of variety. And an inner green space. These are old photographs. This is somewhat run down today. Some of his housing actually has moved up on the social ladder. Very interesting. All these were done for low-income housing. Some of them are planned so well that they're very sought after. This is one of the few that is not. It's in a working-class district, and it's next to Tempelhof Airport. And the noise that airplanes produce has made this less desirable. So it's not in as good shape as some of his other housing. And then lastly, another large estate. This is called Zehlendorf after the district it's in. Sometimes it's referred to as Uncle Tom's housing after Harriet Beecher Stowe. The subway stop is called that. Very large estate, again by this cooperative association. The subway runs in open cut along here, the major street here, along housing development along here, which you see on the right-hand side, that he breaks up again with colored zones to make it seem less long, changing the color as he goes along. Across the street, he never quite believed in using Zeilenbau, the long rows of parallel houses that became very popular in the late 20s among the modernists. He felt they were too monotonous. So he does not do a long block on the other side, but smaller units that are set at right angle. And then more apartment houses here, and then again in the interior row houses. The whole southern center was planned by him but carried out by another architect. And these are the small blocks along the same major thoroughfare that are set at right angles. Here, the large stand of trees that was already there, it's really a forested area, left standing. So from the very beginning, it had this wooded effect and it looked also like a garden suburb. But here, the scheme derived more from the original site and the decision to leave the trees standing. You get a better sense of how wooded this is today. Then the row houses, a little bit less vernacular than in the earlier scheme. This was begun in 26, a year later, and carried on to 32. Color, I show you green examples, there are also red ones and yellow ones. In the course of time, of course, the renovations have altered these houses somewhat, so they're no longer unified. But as at Brits, he uses a wide band in the attic zone to bring the scale down to a very narrow street. Again, this is an idea that comes from city to use psychological experiential factors to make it seem appropriate, to make it seem comfortable, but color used for that, so it's not purely aesthetic or willful or self-expression. And the garden sides of apartment units on the left-hand side, there are also some private gardens with the lower apartments here, and then the private gardens behind the row houses. You see also that many of the owners have changed terraces into sunrooms, etc. Taut then by the late 20s had become somewhat unfashionable among the modernists because he did not turn to the more mechanistic utilitarian schemes that they had turned to. But he was also among the first to criticize what came to be called the international style. In his book on modern architecture of 29, which by the way was also published in English, he shows these illustrations and makes fun of the ship being used as a model for housing, which he thought was totally inappropriate. He makes fun of strip windows and glass, all of the devices that have become customary even before Hitchcock and Johnson defined the international style. Taut already described it in terms of cliches. And lastly, again, a page from, on the right-hand side, the communes from Dissolution of the Cities, and the interior of the horseshoe on the left-hand side. shows the almost decentralized notion that he had held in his utopian books. If we look back then at the pages of his utopian books, they do not represent such a different vision from the one that he held when he designed his housing estates before and after the war. Here we have a metaphoric comment on the community on the right-hand side, what he obviously had not intended for execution, schematically be sure, but it does represent an ideal from which he never veered very much. In Taut's case, it is not meaningful, therefore, to divide his work into rational and anti-rational phases. The continuity of his pre-war expressionist and post-war work exists not so much on a stylistic, formal level. The continuity resides in his underlying concepts, in his specific and strongly held social convictions. The synesthesia, sensory richness, and mobility of the utopian phase is translated into an awareness of emotive and experiential factors. They become a humanizing force which keeps his housing from becoming too technocratic. The seemingly irrational then as a way of becoming exceedingly rational. Thank you.
And if anyone wants to ask questions, just feel free to talk to me. We have the lights on too. Actually,
No. Some of the photographs I showed actually were done in the late 60s, so I can't get my right
yeah, because I was
well, there's one Brits, but the one Zealand were actually has color.
I just have to ask. Well, it's almost one of the
Yeah, it has said yes, right. Engelmann, No, I mean, the one across the street always has some long apartment blocks. They're very conservatively done. They were done by conservative architects in a picturesque mode.
Like the glass house for an exhibition.
Yeah, but it wasn't.
See the fragment landscape, which
No, but the architects across the street are not bad. They were not architects at all. They were among the most conservative architects.
Their architecture was the protest from the conservative against rationalism.
No, not against the rationalists. Just no, it wasn't against. No, I don't think it's against rationalism. It was in Taut's case. It was just against modernity. They all came to be rational, by the way. If you look at the writers of the most conservative, they all said they're rational. There wasn't a term that was used in the way it's used today. It was simply again. Taut was Bruno was a modernist by the very use. But it also shows you that what the image we have of the international style today is too uniform. In fact, included. I mean,